this yours?
I never saw it before in my life.
You're lying. I saw you throw it away. Kill him.
Imagine accidentally knocking over a sacred statue in an Egyptian temple. You might expect a scolding or maybe a fine, but in ancient Egypt, even minor mistakes inside a temple could land you in serious spiritual danger. The rules weren't just strict, they were enforced with punishments that could ruin your life and reputation, sometimes with the whole community watching. Today, we're looking at the brutal reality for anyone who insulted the gods. From public whippings to being buried alive, the ancient Egyptians made sure blasphemy was never taken lightly. Stay tuned to uncover the legal logic behind these terrifying rituals and just how easy it was to find yourself in trouble. In ancient Egypt, blasphemy wasn't just about shouting insults at a statue or defacing a temple wall. The Egyptians treated their gods as active guardians of daily life, responsible for the Nile's flooding, the growth of crops, and even the rising sun. So any disrespect, no matter how small, was seen as a direct threat to the balance of the universe. Temple etiquette was strict, and everyone knew it. For example, entering a temple required ritual purity. Records from the New Kingdom mention priests shaving their entire bodies and abstaining from certain foods before approaching the sanctuary. Failing to follow these rituals could be interpreted as an insult to the gods themselves. Even the way you spoke mattered. Prayers and recitations were supposed to be flawless, and mistakes in pronunciation or ritual could land you in serious trouble. Grain tithes were another area where religious law and daily life collided. Giving a share of your harvest to the temple wasn't just a civic duty, it was considered an offering to the divine. Refusing or neglecting this obligation could be prosecuted as an offense against the gods, not just the state. Surviving records describe offenders being subjected to corporal punishments designed to shame them and serve as a warning to others. Intent didn't really factor into these laws. You could accidentally drop an offering or mispronounce a sacred word and still be found guilty. The punishment wasn't just about making you pay, it was about restoring cosmic order and making sure everyone else got the message. Many of these rules weren't written down either. Temple restrictions were often oral traditions. Ignorance offered no defense. Archaeologists have uncovered court records where defendants claimed they didn't know about a certain prohibition, but the verdict was always the same: guilty. Artifacts in modern museums look beautiful and untouchable behind glass, but in ancient Egypt, getting too close to a sacred object could have real consequences. What we consider minor mistakes, forgetting a ritual step, wearing the wrong clothing, or making an offhand joke about a god, could result in punishments that were harsh and very public. The goal wasn't just to correct your behavior, it was to reinforce the idea that the gods demanded total respect all the time. Priests kept careful records of these cases, not just as legal documents, but as religious texts. The archives from temples like Karnak are filled with lists of punishments for religious offenses, each one reinforcing the message that the god's authority was absolute. And those were only the cases important enough to write down. Most minor infractions probably disappeared into the oral tradition, passed along as cautionary tales. But the real lesson came not from the rules themselves, but from what happened when someone broke them.
Sire, he must die.
Next, we look at how these punishments became public spectacles, making examples out of offenders for everyone to see. The temple steps in ancient Egypt weren't just for climbing, they were the setting for religious punishment. When someone crossed the line with the gods, priests made sure everyone knew about it. Public beatings took place right outside the sanctuary, with priests invoking the gods as they struck. The offender, stripped to a linen loincloth, was forced to kneel and endure the punishment in full view of the community. Archaeological reliefs show assistants holding the offender steady, making sure every lash landed where it was meant to. Punishment lengths weren't random. The number of lashes or the type of whip used often depended on the perceived importance of the god who'd been insulted. For some, it was cowhide. For others, crocodile skin. The point wasn't just to hurt, it was to purify. Temple texts describe how pain was supposed to drive out spiritual pollution, and the chants priests used during these punishments called on the gods to witness the cleansing. It wasn't about anger or revenge, it was a ritual, a way to restore balance after someone threatened the sacred order. These punishments didn't stop with the beating itself. The aftermath had its own rituals. Priests sometimes gathered the bloodied sand from beneath the whipping post or had offenders participate in symbolic acts meant to show their impurity was being removed. These weren't just humiliations, they were reminders that the gods' justice reached beyond the pain of the moment. Everything was about making the punishment stick in people's minds so no one would forget the price of disrespect. You wouldn't want to be the person dragged in front of your neighbors for this kind of punishment. The process was methodical and left little room for mercy. If you lost count of the lashes, you started over. If you tried to hide your pain, priests made sure to draw it out. Public whippings weren't just about suffering, they were about sending a message. The temple steps became a warning sign for anyone thinking about breaking the rules. And every blow was a lesson in how seriously the Egyptians took their spiritual order. These public rituals weren't random cruelty. They were carefully calibrated threats against anyone who dared disrespect the divine order. But for some offenders, the pain didn't end when the crowd went home. There were punishments that left marks you could never hide, branding you as an enemy of the gods for the rest of your life. Let's talk about the punishments that went beyond pain and humiliation. Punishments that followed you everywhere you went. In ancient Egypt, branding wasn't just about marking someone as a criminal. It was a spiritual sentence. Priests sometimes pressed red-hot irons into the flesh of offenders, burning in religious symbols that made it clear you crossed a line the gods didn't forgive. These marks weren't just for the living. Temple texts describe them as warnings to the gods themselves, meant to haunt you in the afterlife. Archaeological evidence backs up the practice. Some mummies show scars in the shapes of recognizable symbols like the dung beetle for Khepri or the sickle for Osiris. One male mummy from the 20th dynasty had a scar on his forearm, and temple records from the same period mention branding as punishment for defiling sacred spaces. The wound was sometimes treated with salt or vinegar, making sure it healed into a scar that would never fade. The idea was simple. Everyone who saw that mark would know exactly what you'd done, and so would the gods. Priests didn't just stick to one symbol. If you stole from a temple dedicated to Hathor, you could end up with a cow symbol burned into your skin. Curse Osiris at the wrong time of year, and you might get a sickle-shaped scar on your cheek. The most severe brands were placed on the face, where no hairstyle or clothing could hide them. These marks served as a permanent warning to the community. This person had angered the gods, so keep your distance. Some texts even hint at more secretive punishments. There are rumors in temple archives about hidden marks, created with special oils or pigments that only priests could recognize under certain conditions. Whether or not these stories are true, they show just how far the priests would go to keep offenders under control. The tools for branding weren't always kept behind temple walls either. Punishment irons sometimes made their way into the hands of regular citizens, and there are records of neighbors using them to settle religious disputes on their own. This wasn't just a priestly power play, it was a community enforcement tool, and everyone knew what those marks meant. The consequences didn't stop with the person who was branded. In some cases, an entire family could be banned from temple events because of one ancestor's crime. A stele from Karnak lists nearly 20 people blacklisted from ceremonies, all because of a branded relative. That's the kind of social punishment that could haunt your descendants for generations. And if you think a scar is bad, imagine a punishment where you disappear entirely. Some offenders faced something even worse than public branding, punishments that happened out of sight in places where daylight never reached. Some punishments in ancient Egypt took place far from public view. Some archaeologists suspect that hidden vaults beneath temple floors weren't just for storing relics. They may have doubled as punishment cells for those who crossed the gods. These underground spaces were cramped, dark, and almost impossible to escape. Offenders sentenced to these chambers faced isolation and slow starvation, sealed off from the world above. The process, according to temple records and some physical evidence, was systematic. After sentencing, priests would lead the condemned down narrow passages and lock them away in small stone cells. Some of these rooms were so tight you couldn't stand up straight or stretch out fully. The doors were thick and air holes were placed just out of reach, making every breath a struggle. Archaeologists have found human remains in these chambers, bones curled in unnatural positions, sometimes with signs of restraint. While not every detail is clear, the evidence suggests these people didn't die quickly. Priests saw this suffering as more than just punishment. Temple texts imply that a starving prisoner's pain was an offering to the gods, a kind of living sacrifice meant to appease divine anger. There are hints that priests sometimes tossed bits of food into the cell, always just out of reach, extending the ordeal and making the suffering last longer. Some descriptions mention sensory deprivation and psychological torment, like leaving empty water jars within sight or letting the condemned hear the sounds of temple life above, but never join it. Victims of these punishments came from all walks of life. Offenses ranged from ritual mistakes to accidental insults, and sometimes entire families paid the price for one person's blunder. Archaeologists have found remains of both men and women, young and old, in these underground spaces. In some cases, temple records list the names and supposed crimes of those sent below, but the details are often sparse. What's clear is that these punishments were designed to erase offenders from both society and memory, all while keeping the machinery of temple life running smoothly above. Even today, you can visit certain temples and see sealed-off doors or small windowless rooms carved deep into the stone. Most visitors walk right past, never knowing what went on behind those walls. The faint scratch marks, the worn floors, and the silence of these chambers are all that remain of a punishment meant to last as long as the temple itself. But public steps and hidden cells were only part of the story. Egyptian priests had another way to deal with blasphemers, one that didn't just punish the body, but threatened the soul itself. Let's talk about what happened if you crossed the line, literally. For ancient Egyptians, temple boundaries weren't just fences or walls. They marked the edge of holy ground, a place where everyday rules ended and the gods' rules began. Step over that edge after insulting a deity, and you risked a punishment that was as much about your soul as your body. Archaeologists have uncovered burials at temple perimeters that suggest ritualized live interment. These weren't hidden away in some remote desert. They were right where everyone could see, a warning to stay on the right side of the gods. The setup was simple, but the impact was brutal. Offenders might be buried at the very edge of the temple's land, sometimes with their heads exposed. This wasn't a quick execution. Some evidence points to slow deaths, with the condemned left out in the open for days. The idea was to make the suffering visible, a public lesson in what happens if you insult the divine. Records from several temples mention crowds passing by, sometimes during festivals, forced to watch as the punishment played out. Why go to these lengths? By burying someone at the sacred edge, priests believed they condemned the soul to linger in limbo. The boundary wasn't just a physical line, it was a spiritual roadblock. The belief was that a person trapped between sacred and profane ground would never reach the afterlife. Instead, their spirit would be stuck at the edge forever, unable to move forward, unable to return. This was the ultimate warning. You wouldn't just lose your life, you'd lose any chance at peace after death. There was a ritual to the whole process. Evidence shows physical restraints were used to keep the condemned from escaping. Bindings, ropes, sometimes even weights. Archaeologists have found remains with hands tied or arms pinned, and in some cases, objects placed in the grave that may have served as magical measures to bind the spirit. It wasn't just about keeping the body in place, it was about making sure the soul couldn't slip away either. Word of these punishments spread quickly. Letters from ancient workers warned family members not to get too close to temple boundaries after dark, just in case someone accused them of trespassing. Graffiti and simple carving show heads sticking out of the ground, a crude but effective reminder of what could happen if you made the wrong joke or crossed the wrong line. What set these burials apart was their lasting effect. While most criminals might eventually find rest in the afterlife, those buried at the boundary were meant to suffer long after their bodies were gone. This boundary practice wasn't just punishment, it was a statement about life, death, and who truly belonged to the gods. But punishment in ancient Egypt didn't always stop at the grave. Sometimes priests made sure you carried your sentence on your body, visible to everyone for the rest of your life. Let's talk about what happened when priests decided punishment alone wasn't enough, when they wanted to make sure everyone remembered your crime every time they saw you. In ancient Egypt, mutilation was a form of divine justice, and it was brutally straightforward. If you used your tongue to blaspheme, you might lose it. Steal with your fingers? Say goodbye to a joint or two. The logic behind these punishments was simple. Remove the offending body part so you couldn't use it to sin again. Priests didn't just choose these mutilations at random. Court records and temple reliefs describe specific links between the crime and the punishment. Tongues were cut out for those who spoke against the gods or mumbled through sacred hymns. Sometimes the removed part was offered ritually to a deity's symbolic animal or placed at the feet of a god statue as a warning to others. Fingers were a common target for thieves, especially those who stole from temple storerooms. Reliefs at Karnak show the first joints of the right thumb and forefinger being severed, the exact parts needed to pick up sacred objects. Archaeologists have found jars holding small bones labeled with the owner's name and crime, a permanent record of their offense. Ears were another favorite, especially for ignoring priestly commands or failing to listen during rituals. At the Temple of Amun, priests sometimes sliced off just the outer rim of the ear, a technique that left you able to hear but marked you for life as someone who didn't obey. Eyes were reserved for the worst offenses. If you were caught defacing a sacred image or mocking a god in writing, you could be blinded. There's a record of a scribe punished with heated copper rods for drawing an unflattering picture of Thoth, the god of wisdom. Afterward, he was forced to keep working, his handwriting growing shakier until it stopped altogether. Sometimes the punishments were more subtle, but just as cruel. Dancers who performed poorly in temple ceremonies had their big toes partially removed, ruining their balance forever. Priests kept careful records of these acts, listing every body part removed and the reason why. The point wasn't just pain or humiliation. These disfigurements served as permanent warnings, marking offenders for life and silencing dissent. They made sure everyone understood. Disrespect the gods or the priests who spoke for them, and you'd carry the consequences forever. And as you might guess, these punishments weren't just about religious purity. In a society where religion and politics were tightly bound, mutilation became a tool for control, one that reached far beyond the temple walls. If you think all those gruesome punishments were just about keeping the gods happy, think again. Blasphemy charges could be leveled for political gain, making divine law a tool of power. The line between religious justice and political maneuvering was razor thin, and everyone in ancient Egypt knew it. Accusing someone of offending the gods was a fast track to removing rivals, silencing critics, or just grabbing what they owned. Whenever power changed hands, records suggest accusations of blasphemy and ritual impurity shot up. It's not a coincidence. When a new pharaoh stepped in, or when priests felt their influence slipping, suddenly there were a lot more offenders being called out for disrespecting the gods. The temples of Amun were known hotspots for these political battles, with scribes and priests keeping close tabs on who might be getting too comfortable with power. One month, you're a trusted official. The next, you're hauled up for breathing on sacred texts or improper temple entry. The penalties weren't just about pain, they were about making examples out of people, especially if they had connections to the wrong side. If you thought being punished was bad, imagine what happened to your family. In some cases, the families of the accused suffered lasting bans and lost their status for generations. A single accusation could mean your children and grandchildren were barred from temple service, public office, or even certain neighborhoods. The records at Karnak and Medinet Habu show entries where a relative's ancient crime was enough to deny someone burial rights or a decent job decades later. The message was clear. One person's mistake could ruin an entire bloodline. Religious punishment also came with the side of asset stripping. Property of the convicted often ended up in temple coffers. If you were a wealthy merchant and got accused of cursing a god, you might lose your ships, your livestock, your house, everything. And it wasn't just about taking wealth. The temple would sometimes put your branded relatives to work, running what used to be your own business, now under priestly control. It was a win-win for the temple. Punish a supposed blasphemer and get richer in the process. The priesthood played a dangerous game. High priests could tip the scales against pharaohs by suddenly declaring divine displeasure. There are cases where entire cities were labeled unclean, and officials who backed the wrong ruler found themselves facing punishments far worse than exile. Even after death, the politics didn't stop. Some tombs show extra curses or heavy modifications meant to keep disgraced officials from ever finding peace in the afterlife. The legal process looked official. Witnesses, testimony, lots of ritual, but at its core, it was about who had the power to accuse and who didn't dare defend themselves. At every level, religious law in Egypt was a political weapon, honed to silence enemies and seize wealth. But not every punishment happened in the open. Some of the most terrifying sentences were carried out where no one could see them, deep inside the temple walls. Let's talk about the punishments nobody wanted to see, or talk about. While public whippings and brandings were meant to scare everyone into obedience, There were rumors among temple workers about what happened to those who disappeared inside certain corridors and never came back out. Whispered stories passed between laborers and scribes spoke of subterranean oubliettes hidden deep beneath the temple floors, where offenders faced torments that never made it into official records. These secret spaces weren't just for show. Priests developed a whole arsenal of private punishments, each one designed to break a person in ways that left no public trace. Some chambers were built for slow starvation. People were dropped through ceiling hatches into cells with no doors, left to die out of sight and out of mind. Workers who cleaned the upper halls would sometimes hear noises from below, scratching, muffled cries, or nothing at all. Other hidden punishments involved water, darkness, or complete isolation. There are records of offenders being tied to posts in underground cisterns left for the rising Nile to claim. Sensory deprivation was another favorite. Some priests led offenders into rooms painted to look like endless desert, leaving them alone with just enough food to survive, but not enough to stay sane. The walls in these places sometimes show endless scratch marks or footprints circling the same spot over and over. These weren't punishments meant to kill quickly. They were designed to erase a person's sense of self, to make them vanish from memory before they even died. And then there were the psychological games. Some punishments left no physical scars at all. Temple texts mention rituals where the condemned was strapped beneath a statue, forced to endure dripping water or suffocating cloth, all while priests recited prayers above. The idea was to purify the soul through suffering, but in reality, it was just another way to control people through fear. The worst part? No one outside the priesthood knew exactly what went on. The official temple histories are silent. There are no carvings, no public lists of the condemned. Even when ancient visitors asked about strange noises or missing workers, the priests brushed it off as the wind or the gods at work. This system of secret punishment worked because it was invisible. People heard stories, but there was never any proof, just rumors, missing neighbors, and the occasional note sent to families saying their loved one was serving the temple forever. Archaeologists today have only pieced together bits of the truth from bones, sealed rooms, and the rare scribbled note. For every public whipping or branding, there were probably several punishments that happened where no one could watch and no one dared ask questions. You might wonder why we don't see more about these punishments in museum displays or history books. There's a reason for that, and it has to do with what later generations chose to remember and what they decided to leave out. If you walk through any major museum's Egyptian gallery, you'll see rows of gold masks, painted coffins, and polished statues. What you won't see are the branding irons, the whips, or the stone blocks used to tie people down. Most museums display golden treasures, while tools of punishment stay in storage or get vague labels like ritual implement. That's not an accident. Early Egyptologists often glossed over evidence of punishment in favor of grand narratives about pharaohs, pyramids, and lost riches. The darker side of ancient Egyptian life didn't fit the story they wanted to tell. Take the way early excavators handled uncomfortable finds. When teams uncovered skeletons with bound wrists or strange marks near temple sites, they sometimes left them out of official reports. Diaries and field notes from those days mentioned disturbing discoveries best left unrecorded. If a chamber full of bones was found beneath a temple, it might be quietly reburied or labeled as a storage room for visitors. Even today, you can visit famous temples and see sealed doors or strange side rooms. Guides call them storerooms, but there's more to the story. Museum curators have always been creative with their labels. A bronze cat statue in a glass case might be described as a Bastet idol late period, but you won't hear about the blood residue found on similar statues or the grooves made to collect liquid offerings. Temple records describe rituals involving these objects, sometimes as part of punishments, but those details rarely make it onto the little placards in front of the display. The same goes for stone troughs and rods with odd shapes, usually labeled as altar accessories or ritual tools, even when temple texts suggest a more sinister use. It's not just museums. Textbooks and exhibits tend to sideline Egypt's darker rituals. Academic books spend pages on temple ceremonies, but only a few lines on punishments, often tucked away in chapters about crime or social order. The result is a sanitized version of history, one where Egypt looks more civilized than other ancient cultures. Even Hollywood sticks to the script. Movies show bright, clean temples with chanting priests and never a hint of what might have happened in the shadows. Why does this happen? Part of it is about protecting Egypt's image. Museums want happy visitors, schools want simple stories, and archaeologists want to keep their funding. There's not much appetite for digging into temple torture devices, so the artifacts stay in storage, the carvings stay covered, and the darker stories stay out of the spotlight. But the truth is, those artifacts and carvings are still there, hidden in basements and behind layers of plaster. Every time you walk past a display case or listen to a tour guide, you have to wonder, what else might lie beneath the surface of those gleaming exhibits? Behind all the gold and glory, Egypt's temples enforced faith through fear and spectacle. One careless joke, a missed ritual, or a moment of disrespect could bring harsh punishment. Branding, whipping, or worse. Those impressive monuments weren't just sites of worship. They were also places where the rules were clear and the consequences even clearer. So, which ancient rule would trip you up, and what ritual might have awaited you? If you found these hidden rituals shocking, hit like and subscribe to join our deep dive into history's untold stories.